Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the annual Theodore White Lecture on Press and Politics that commemorates the life of the late reporter and historian. I must say that Teddy White, as he is affectionately known to many people, has an extraordinary background and career. He was a Harvard College graduate of 1934 and went to on a newsboys scholarship, and he went to China where he was on a Sheldon Fellowship from Harvard and watched the Japanese bombing of Chongqing before the war. During the war, he continued to cover East Asia for time and returned to write Thunder Out of China, which was a highly critical and important book. So that in itself would have been a sufficient career for most people. But he went on to essentially analyze his own country, and his work on the various books on the making of the American president, starting in 1960, but in 64, 72, really became a new hallmark of American journalism as well as American history. He was a member of the visiting committee of the Kennedy School before his death in 1986, and in that capacity he helped with the planning for what became eventually the Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy. So the annual Teddy White Lecture, or I should say the Theodore H. White Lecture on Press and Politics, has become something which is deeply cherished here in the Kennedy School, and we are particularly privileged this evening to have one of my favorite people in this world of the press to deliver the lecture. But unfortunately, the head of the Shorenstein Center, not the dean, gets the fun of introducing her. So for that, let me turn to our very distinguished Pulitzer Prize winning head of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press and Politics, Alex Jones.
Thank you, Joe. I also want to welcome you on behalf of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy to the night that we consider to be one of the very, very special nights, one of the great events nights of our whole year. The Theodore White Lecture and the seminar that follows it tomorrow are an opportunity to listen to a journalist or political figure of great stature talk about an issue of great moment. Certainly we have both of those tonight. Before I get to Judy Woodruff, let me say how grateful we are at the Shorenstein Center to the White family and those of you who helped create this and endow this lectureship. It was a lovely way and an appropriate way to memorialize Teddy White. He was a serious man who loved politics and journalism and his country and made an enormous contribution to all three. When Walter Shorenstein agreed to endow the Shorenstein Center as a memorial to his daughter, Joan, he knew that he had a lot in common with Teddy White. He did, and so did she. Walter was not able to be with us tonight, but I know he would agree that the Shorenstein Center considers itself to be in the Teddy White tradition, and it's a lineage that we are very proud to claim. Tomorrow morning, we're going to honor yet another Teddy White tradition, the joy of serious talk, the power, indeed, the power of serious, informed talk. The Theodore White Seminar, which is part of this weekend or this observance, will convene tomorrow at 9 o'clock on the 5th floor of the Taubman Building, which is right over here, and all of you are cordially invited. Taking part in the conversation will be Judy Woodruff, our honored guest tonight, along with a distinguished panel. The point of departure for the seminar will be Judy Woodruff's lecture tonight, but by a long-standing tradition, the talk will range widely, and you are all invited to come and take part. Judy Woodruff. I must confess right off the bat that I am extremely fond of Judy Woodruff. She has that effect on people. One of the dirty secrets of our news business, and especially the big shot Washington news business, is that some journalists have egos the size of Montana. I know that comes as a shock to you. Judy Woodruff is one of the journalists who actually has justification for thinking of herself highly, actually thinking of herself very highly, of being what my father used to describe as a person who goes through life as a big I, little you person. Really, and most remarkably, that is not at all who she is. True, she does sometimes brag about being married to someone who gets to appear each week on a television program with the lovable Robert Novak. But even Judy's estimable husband, Al Hunt, who is here tonight with us, would allow, I think, that she is nicer than he is. I've just called Judy Woodruff nice, which within the journalistic tribe is almost as bad as calling her sweet. It suggests something less than tough, aggressive, determined. It also tends to leave out words like smart, stalwart, high-principled, a rock, a pro. Those are better words to describe Judy Woodruff. I first came to know Judy when I was the Eugene Patterson professor at Duke University, which is Judy's alma mater and where typically she is revered. She is spectacularly generous with the institutions she cares for, including Duke, and I found that there was something of a legend about her from her years not long after her graduation, when she was still relatively fresh to journalism. There's a story of how Judy got her start at a CBS affiliate in Atlanta and then went to work for NBC, still based in Atlanta. Because she was young and therefore didn't know anything, when the 1976 presidential campaign took off, she was assigned to cover the local candidate for president who everyone knew didn't have a chance, Jimmy Carter. This was real Teddy White country. But instead of a bus, she began her political cutting teeth period on campaign planes. In those happier days, before cable television, Friday was the end of the week for both the candidate and the reporters who shadowed him. After a week of campaigning and filing stories for the nightly news, the papers, and so forth, on Friday afternoon, the campaign plane would head for home, and it would be Miller time. There would be a palpable sigh of relief. Shoes would come off. Bottles would open. Bull would begin to fly. And then people like Sam Donaldson, who was on the plane for ABC, would notice this earnest, young NBC correspondent in the back of the plane, working. Not just working, working hard. But working on what? What was she doing? She was reviewing her notes for the week, polishing her Sunday piece, planning for the week to come. It was enough to unnerve the ultimate cool of Sam Donaldson and to make him, and this is a word that was applied by someone who was there, absolutely paranoid. It took a long time for people to come to understand that Judy Woodruff always seems to be working. Note, I didn't say she is always working, because she isn't. That's why she's such a beloved human being. The campaign plane was nearly 30 years ago, but the person who worked while her colleagues kicked back still distinguishes herself by her work ethic. In the words of one of the men who shared that plane with her and has followed her career, she was, and I'm quoting him, focused, organized, disciplined, committed. That has never changed. Listen to this. In her 30-year career as a broadcast journalist, she has won, among many, many honors, the Emmy for her role in CNN's outstanding instant coverage of the Centennial Park bombing. She's won the Cable Ace Award for Best Anchor, along with Bernard Shaw, as well as the Cable Ace Award of her own as Best Newscaster. She has been chosen repeatedly to fill jobs that require judgment and integrity and trust. For instance, She moderated the 1988 vice presidential debate and moderated 4 separate Republican presidential debates during the 2000 campaign. Indeed, politics has been her calling journalistically. She was NBC News' White House correspondent, covering both the Carter and Reagan administrations. She went to McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour as chief Washington correspondent, where she also anchored the award-winning weekly documentary series Frontline with Judy Woodruff. She's now been at CNN for 7 years, is the cable news operations prime anchor and senior correspondent. She anchors Inside Politics, the nation's first program devoted exclusively to politics, and World View, a nightly program on international affairs. She is, in other words, ideally suited to the times and the challenges of those times. Let me also say, before we hear from her, that she's one of the most trusted people in America for a good reason. The genuine decency that she radiates is truly there. She and her husband, Al, devote an enormous amount of time to philanthropic and charitable causes, while they also raise their 3 children. She is an epic multitasker. Her topic this evening: the worst of times, the best of times, television news from OJ to Osama. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our Theodore H. White Lecturer for 2001, Judy Woodruff.
I'm going to get popcorn for that. Thank you, Alex. Actually, the person you described 30 years ago sounds fairly boring. I'm not sure I'd want to have spent much time with her on the campaign bus or in any activity thereafter. I am really delighted to be here with all of you this evening. It is truly an awesome experience to give this lecture at this fabled academy and to join such exceptional company in the Theodore H. White Lecture Series. And as is so often the case at this campus, there are many people here who merit some recognition. And to leave time for the real highlight of these sessions, which is, of course, your participation, I'm just going to cite a few. The Kennedy School, I'll start with that, is the symbol of excellence in public policy studies. I appreciate that even more fully as an alumna of Duke, which Alex mentioned. You know, when we established our own public policy center, the Sanford Institute, there was only one gold standard to emulate, and that was the Kennedy School. How fitting in more than 40 years ago, it was more than 40 years ago, that Terry Sanford was the first prominent Southerner to embrace the presidential quest of John F. Kennedy. And how fitting that these 2 schools honor those 2 exceptional public servants who so inspired young people. Your eminent dean, Joe Nye, equally renowned in the halls of government and academe, is one of those rare experts who journalists call up to find out what we think. Thank you for that, Joe. There is the director of the Shorenstein Center, Alex Jones. Not an easy job, Alex, succeeding the one and only Marvin Kalb. Where are you, Marvin? Right there. Who gave birth and nourished the growth of this center. Thank you for being here. But Alex is building on that legacy, making the Shorenstein Center more exciting and more innovative. Alex has proven that he's a genuine populist. Why else would somebody leave the stratospheric environs of Duke University? I also want to pay special tribute tonight to Kennedy School fellow and lecturer, one of my former bosses, Rick Kaplan. There is no better television news producer anywhere. Some of you are his students, bar none. And you are very lucky indeed to have his unique knowledge of the inner workings of television network news and to have a part of the history that he's experienced, for he has, after all, orchestrated the coverage of so many events that define our age. So thank you for everything you've done for ABC, for CNN, and now for the Kennedy School. Unlike some of your previous lecturers, Ben Bradley, David Broder, and Tom Brokaw, I was not a colleague of Theodore H. White, but he was an idol of mine. I first met him more than 2 decades ago during the New Hampshire primary. I was a young reporter, as Alex said, covering Jimmy Carter. I remember the kindness, I remember the generosity, as well as the exuberance whether it was at a campaign rally or at a breakfast table at the Wayfarer Hotel, that Teddy White always displayed to a young reporter in her 20s who, as Alex said, knew almost nothing. I was a freshman in high school in 1960 when Making of the President 1960 came out. It remains one of the most important books ever written about American politics. It inspired me, and it inspired many of my contemporaries to go into journalism to cover politics. I was a colleague and a dear friend of the namesake of this center, Joan Shorenstein Barone. When I was married, she and Michael threw a party for us. When we brought our first child home from the hospital, one of the first stops was Joan's. Her daughter was a few years older, and Joan was a mentor on the frightening mysteries of motherhood and combining career and family. She was also a compass for so many women in television journalism in the 1970s and 80s. Joan had exceptional energy and vitality, and more than a decade and a half after her all too premature passing, what we remember most was her commitment, her passion for excellence, and her standards. In person, she was modest and self-effacing. Her CBS associate and my CNN colleague and friend Bruce Morton has recalled to me, he said, she had a whim of iron for all of that. I worked for a competitor for NBC, but CBS was considered the crown jewel of television journalism, and Joan was one of the shining stars in that crown. I still miss her, and I will never forget her special qualities. Her father, Walter Shorenstein, couldn't be here physically this evening, but his presence is always felt. Walter's exceptional generosity created this center, but even more important has been his wisdom, his experience, his energy, passion, and abiding devotion to this institution. Joan would be incredibly proud of her father and what he helped create. When Alex Jones first asked me to speak tonight, I will confess, I envisioned some lamentation about the state of my profession. I will confess also that as much as I was honored to be asked, I was really not looking forward to plowing over familiar ground. Even on September the 10th, I was still fending off the charmingly persistent Edie Hallway's request for a speech title. Then two things happened. The next day joined December 7th and November 22nd as one of those dates that live in infamy and changes us all. A short while later, I called my friend Steve Hess for some advice about what I was going to talk about tonight, and he counseled, for God's sake, don't try to be profound. Talk about how you are covering the most important story of your lifetime, the tensions and the triumphs, the debates and the dilemmas. And certainly the world has changed for everyone. I mean, let's think about it. It's hard to believe that it was almost a year ago today that while we were enjoying the greatest economic times of our lives, that Al Gore somehow persuaded 48% of Americans to vote for change. Tonight, I want to try to talk about the experience of covering this most important story that Steve Hess was referring to, of course. I believe that journalism in general and television journalism in particular, and especially my home, the cable news network, has risen brilliantly to the occasion. Under very tough circumstances, I think we provided information, insights, and perspective that have served the country and the world well. People at every news organization I know have worked tirelessly, beyond the breaking point, and they've done it with skill, with perseverance, and presence. We've all made mistakes, but in a story with such wide-ranging uncertainties, there have been few. I'm going to return in just a moment to talk about the particulars from a CNN vantage point. Ironically, if the last 50 days have marked some of our finest hours, the backdrop, the period before that, was far different. From O.J. to Monica to Gary Condit, the news business and television, especially 24-hour cable television news, was under withering criticism. David Halberstam said several years ago during the Monica saga that this was journalism's worst moment in his lifetime, that television news was guilty of an abdication of responsibility. Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, in their book, Warp Speed, stated that a true, reliable account of the day's events has been undermined by what passes for continuous news. And I would just say as an aside, during the Monica Lewinsky story, I'd note that these sins were also committed by a few of the most important newspapers in America, but that's another subject. In fact, there often emerged a Gresham's law of journalism, where if the bad doesn't drive out the good, it at least sets the agenda for the public dialogue. Now, this is frequently exacerbated, I believe, by the television pundits, the ubiquitous pundits who parade as journalists, but who've never covered a police beat, never covered a state legislature. They've never paid their dues. The concept of accountability is alien. All that matters to them are attention and ratings. A disturbing part of this, as David Broder said here at the Shorenstein Center a few years ago, is the thin line between journalists and political practitioners parading as journalists. The media now elevate to the status of celebrities and embrace as journalists, Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel wrote, the same spin doctors and dissemblers that once were paid to manipulate them. As Ben Bradley told you a few years ago, spinning is another word for lying. CNN is not immune when we talk about this. Pat Buchanan and Jesse Jackson, both of whom had their own shows on CNN, are interesting and provocative public figures, but they're not journalists. The problem with blurring this line between journalists and political practitioners is that it confuses viewers and it only adds to public cynicism. What somebody labeled the argument culture has also aggravated one of the real bogus complaints about television and CNN, that there's an ideological bias. You know, I worked with Bernie Shaw for 8 years, and I don't have the foggiest idea for whom he voted or even if he voted. In more than 8 years at CNN, I've heard a lot of suggestions, many of them good, some of them not so good, but I've never heard one that was politically or ideologically motivated. Fox, one of our competitors, provide great, tough competition, but not because of ideology. It's because of first-class journalists who work there, like Britt Hume, and, his bravado notwithstanding, shrewd executives like Roger Ailes. The problem with this phony argument over ideology is that it camouflages the real issues. For example, too often all of us in television abdicate our responsibilities to focus on the superficial or the salacious over the substantive. Crime has actually declined in America in recent years. But take a poll, and in many places, most places, people will say crime is steadily rising. If they rely mainly on local television for their news and the steady staple is mayhem and violence, in most places it is, why should that surprise us? More alarming is that politics, the electoral process, the lifeblood of a free society, is now seen as a turnoff. I think that would astound Teddy White. In the 1998 race for governor of California, the leading television station in the top 5 markets in that state made millions of dollars off of candidate advertising. But that fall, according to a survey by the University of Southern California, those same stations devoted less than 1/3 of 1% of their news airtime to the gubernatorial race. Now, much of this undeniably reflects the dominance of the bottom line in journalism. We are part of a business. Profits have always mattered. Initially, it was an important consideration. In recent years, it's too often appeared to be the only or the dominant consideration. Nowhere has this been more glaring than in the draconian reduction in international news coverage. Several decades ago, foreign correspondents were a signature element of network television journalism. Each of them had 15 to 20 foreign bureaus. Today, they have less than half that. Last year, the networks, by one reliable calculation, and we know the networks are where most Americans who watch television news get their news and information, last year ran 1/3 as many stories from abroad as they did a decade earlier. ABC, with Peter Jennings, one of the legendary foreign correspondents who once anchored their evening news out of London, has cut its foreign bureaus from 17 to 7 over the last decade and a half. And I don't mean to single out ABC. This is a picture across the board of the broadcast networks. Over the past 7 weeks, much attention has been paid to the culture and the mores and the attitudes of the Muslim world. And yet the major networks, which still draw the largest audiences, are almost invisible in the Islamic world. None of them had a bureau with a full-time correspondent in Cairo or Islamabad before September the 11th. Even today, I find it astounding, none of the 3 commercial broadcast networks have a full-time correspondent in Beijing. So at the same time that we report expansively about the global village, or conversely, we talk about the clash of cultures, American television news is primarily crisis-driven. You know, in journalism, we talk about stories that are, we like to call them my eyes glaze over, or amigos. The importance of the balance of payments, for example. Suppose 2 months ago, a top television correspondent proposed the following extended pieces for television coverage or specials. Kashmir, now think 2 months ago, Kashmir, the bitter struggle between 2 second-tier powers with different religions and with nuclear weapons. Cairo, the political and cultural center of the Arab world, where in grassroots mosques and madrasas, anti-American hatred is spewed daily. Poverty. In the age of global affluence, there are 2.5 billion people subsisting on less than $1 a day. Terror. The potential global reach of bioterrorism. All of them would have been considered Migos. Then, September the 11th. Television news responded immediately and comprehensively. The commercial networks preempted programming for the entire day and big chunks of the days to follow. Commercials were suspended on the cable outlets. ABC, CBS, and NBC were magnificent. Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, the people, the names that are so familiar to us, with their calm confidence, their consummate professionalism, they took their place with the Cronkites and the Huntleys and the Brinkleys of an earlier era. The new element here was cable, or the continuous news cycle. As an anchor person for CNN, that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. As you all know, at CNN, the salad days, we like to call them, of no cable competition, such as we enjoyed during the Gulf War 10 years ago, had vanished. We were under a ratings assault from Fox and MSNBC. The bottom line, never insignificant, took on even more importance. Dramatic changes were in the offing. Some of them were good. We were bringing in anchors, new anchors like Aaron Brown from ABC, Paul Azan from Fox, and the elevation of the veteran, respected newsman Walter Isaacson to become chairman of the CNN News Group. Other changes that were being discussed, more troubling. The New York Times, among others, reported that CNN was planning to dramatically cut back on foreign bureaus and move to more entertaining or softer news in order to regain our lost ground. Much of that rationale collapsed shortly after the Twin Towers in the west side of the Pentagon did. The last 7 weeks have, as Walter Isaacson noted, helped us regain our focus. He told the New York Times, "It has restored our true mission, hard reporting and smart analysis, and to cover international news in a serious way." From the inception, from the outset of this crisis, leaders and opinion makers turned to CNN. Not only did CNN have 31 foreign bureaus before September 11th, but alone among the television networks that day, CNN already had an experienced correspondent, Nick Robertson, in Kabul. He was there to cover the trial of 2 American aid workers. We had satellite capability. We had a video phone already in place. Today, almost 2 months into this story, we have 75 people at last count. This was as of about a week ago, working for us in the region, in Central Asia and the Middle East, 40 of them in Pakistan alone. It's no overstatement to say, I think, our coverage has been very strong. In a total hard news environment, we've been aggressive, and I think we've been creative. We've made mistakes, yes, In the first few days, I think all of us in television probably reran that video of the airplanes slamming into the Trade Center more than we should have. On September the 11th, CNN reported that there was a truck full of explosives on one of the bridges leading out of Manhattan. Our sources were 3 different police officials, but they were wrong. When the government started to release the names a few days later of the hijackers, we put 2 names out that were mistakes. One of the men we named was dead. And on the first day of the bombing, a few weeks ago, we misidentified some of our weapons systems. There have been other mistakes. But as soon as we realized them, we corrected them. And our goal, of course, is not to make mistakes. When journalism functions at its best, as the late Washington Post publisher Phil Graham declared, it is a rough first draft of history. It is an impossible task, though, to always function at your best when you are reporting on a story 24 hours a day. It is, I think, instructive in trying to convey truth, to remember the wisdom of Albert Camus, who said there is no truth, there are only truths. Where was I on September the 11th that morning? Well, I was at home reading the newspapers, no television or radio on, so I could finish with the editorials that day. I walked out the door just about 9 o'clock, a few minutes after, turned on the car radio on NPR, and I heard breaking news about an airplane running into the Trade Center. I called my researcher on the car phone just as she was trying to call me. She told me it was 2 planes. I drove like crazy. I called Sid Bedingfield, who was our vice president for news. He told me to rush to the set. I was on the air from about 10:30 that morning till almost 6:30 that evening. Much of it is a blur, but there are moments that stand out. Seeing the ghastly pictures of the planes hitting the Trade Center, watching the towers collapse in those monstrous clouds of smoke, seeing the supposedly invincible Pentagon with a gash in its side, the moment when we were told the United States Capitol was being evacuated, and then when we learned the President of the United States was flying to military bases in Louisiana and Nebraska rather than returning to Washington. As the enormity of what had happened began to sink in, as we replayed the video of the towers coming down, I remember being speechless. Normally, that is the cardinal sin in television. But this time, it was the only appropriate thing to do. The next afternoon, I remember as our correspondent Elizabeth Cohen interviewed the brother of a woman who was missing at the Trade Center, and this was just one of dozens and dozens of interviews like this. Elizabeth became emotional listening to this woman's story, and when she threw it back to me in the studio, I was in tears. So CNN, how did we do? Well, we've gotten critical acclaim, and we've picked up a lot of viewers. Opinion makers, we're told, in Washington and New York and Cairo and Moscow, and I mean Egypt and Russia, not Illinois or Ohio or Idaho, are watching CNN. Why? Well, first, tradition. We're only a little more than 2 decades old, but CNN is synonymous with important big news stories. That's what Ted Turner envisioned, and during my 8 years, Tom Johnson, the man who hired me, Rick Kaplan, and now Walter Isaacson have cared deeply about that tradition, that responsibility. Our advantage may diminish during normal news times. We may get beaten occasionally on the Gary Condit stories, but we remain, I think, the gold standard at this point when there's big news. The week the bombing started, our ratings went up again. Number 2, we have not cut back on foreign bureaus. We were better situated than anybody to cover this story. And I would start with the incomparable Christiane Amanpour, who has just done unparalleled reporting throughout her career, never finer, I think, than what she has been doing for us out of Pakistan. Thank you. This is going to sound like I'm patting CNN on the back, and that is what I'm doing, but bear with me, forgive me. There's a reason. Nick Robertson, whom I just mentioned, was one of only a few Western reporters and probably the most experienced to be inside Afghanistan when September 11th happened. He stayed in the country for several days under threat until one morning at 2 a.m. in Atlanta, our head of international news gathering, a man named Eason Jordan, got a call from Nick saying that the Taliban had told him if he stayed one more hour, he was going to be dismembered. Eason told Nick to do what he felt comfortable doing. These are Eason's words. I said, Eason, what did you say to him? Well, Nick ended up staying a few more days. He figured out a way to pull that off until the Taliban actually ordered him out of the country. Since then, he's primarily been right across the border in Pakistan until a couple of days ago. He was allowed in about 2 weeks ago to go in on sort of a quick journalist tour in the northern part of the country. But just now, just 2 days ago, he was permitted back into Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. What you should know is that he is supported by that cast of 75, including we have 5 people, at least 5, stationed for us throughout Afghanistan, serving as our eyes and ears. And I can't give you their names because I'm not even given their names. It's being very closely held, but those are the people we rely on for information about, to the best of our ability, to tell you what the bomb damage is, what is the casualty situation, how much damage has been done, and so forth. All of this has been indispensable overseas, and I'm just giving you a quick slice of it. Equally impressive has been the commitment on the home front. Whether it's, I'm going to name a lot of our correspondents because I think every one of them has just been stupendous in what they've done. John King, Kelly Wallace, Major Garrett at the White House, Jamie McIntyre, Bob Franken at the Pentagon, Andrea Koppel at the State Department, Kate Snow, John Carl on Capitol Hill, Eileen O'Connor, Kelly Arena on the investigation. And I'm leaving many people out. We have focused day after day on solid, reliable reporting. So it's an important story, I think, that's given us an important advantage over the competition, who I think still rely more at times on pundits than they do on reporters. I want to tell you I'm not biased against pundits because I'm married to one. They have a role to play. But seriously, in moments of crisis or big stories, I think Americans are more interested in facts than being told what they should think. And when they turn to a news organization for information, that's what they're looking for. And there's still appropriate times for capital gain and their competition. Al's giving me the evil eye. To be sure, we've relied on and we've used former military leaders who are now consultants, especially ex-NATO Commander General Wesley Clark. We've relied heavily on former retired Air Force General Don Shepard, 2 people whose perspective and experience, among some others, has just been invaluable. Every day there are tough calls with controlled information. How much to accept the Pentagon's version of the war? How much emphasis to give the inevitable civilian casualties in any bombing campaign? How do you fairly cover the commander-in-chief without being a cheerleader or a carping critic? Almost everyone is now nervous, at least we are in Washington, with coverage of the domestic threat. How do we convey real peril without making people feel panic unnecessarily? It's turned out to be a lot more difficult than most of us appreciated. Consider for a moment that you're a news executive or an anchor in October. It's October the 17th, 2 days after the anthrax threat hit the office of Senator Tom Daschle, 5 days after Tom Brokaw's assistant contracted anthrax. The United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, has tried to reassure everyone that everything's under control. Senator Bill Frist, the doctor, physician, a surgeon from Tennessee, said that same day we were underprepared for any threat. The House of Representatives decided to adjourn for 5 days. The Senate decided to stay in session while closing its office buildings. Dick Gephardt, the House Majority Leader, said the Minority Leader, said the anthrax found in Tom Daschle's office was weapons grade. House Speaker Dennis Hastert talked about anthrax sweeping through the ventilation systems in Congress, potentially affecting hundreds of people. But the official declaration from the CDC and others was it was only garden variety anthrax. The threats were at a minimum, we were told, and basically the government was saying we don't know enough to comment at all. HHS officials weren't commenting on the record, and all the FBI would say is that it's investigating the situation. All right, you tell me, what's the storyline? What's your lead? Did television and CNN sometimes give out conflicting messages that day? You bet we did. Was it avoidable? I don't see how. It would be wrong for us to sensationalize any of these points of view, but it's equally unrealistic to ask us to ignore these contradictions and conflicts, some of them very understandable under the circumstances. There are, when it comes to war coverage, there are equally challenging, different issues, few tougher than how to cover Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, or as the president puts it, the forces of evil. This is a phenomenon nobody anticipated, a terrorist organization living out of remote caves with Madison Avenue media savvy. The first big test was bin Laden's videotaped message on Al Jazeera, the Arab television network everybody knows about now, the same night the United States began the air campaign against the Taliban. CNN, which had an exclusive contract with Al Jazeera, immediately ran the tape unedited, as did the other networks. But when a second tape surfaced, 2 days later, White House National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice called the network chiefs and suggested that we think carefully about airing comments from the enemy that could contain a hidden message to a terrorist network. There was never a request, per se, and there was, I know, virtually no debate inside CNN about what was the right thing to do. I was told, in fact, there were already discussions before her call came in from the night before when that tape was first made available, questions about whether we should be airing it in its entirety or in any form, for that matter. Everybody on CNN's 6th floor in Atlanta, which is where the executives are, agreed. So decisions were taken separately at CNN and Fox, ABC, CBS, and NBC to be more cautious about airing these tapes. All of us decided not to run for that moment, any more al-Qaeda statements in their entirety. In the case of CNN, we said that great care would be used before we aired any of their statements at all. What about what Dr. Rice talked about? What about her message? Clearly, it was something with merit, something we would pay attention to. We had run the first bin Laden statement instantaneously without giving it a lot of thought. But I would defend the airing of that first tape. It was extraordinary news to see and hear the man thought to be responsible for the greatest act of terrorism ever perpetrated on America. But to repeatedly air these tapes, I think would give many of us pause. To give a mass murder a run of our airways is something that makes us all feel, I think, at the very least, troubled. The current policy that we have articulated is to be selective, to take it on a case-by-case basis. I think that that is good journalism. Still, all of this is not without elements of the slippery slope. The government wants to control information. They've tried to do that in several instances. Now, that's not unique to the Bush crowd. During the Clinton administration, sources tell me it was commonplace for the NSC head Sandy Berger to wake up a top justice or CIA official at 5 o'clock in the morning to complain about national security leaks in the Washington Post or the New York Times. Those leaks and this adversarial relationship sometimes make governing more difficult. But press critics, I believe, are usually not persuasive in claiming they have produced real dangers to national security. Another tough call for CNN arose with the invitation from Al Jazeera to CNN to submit questions to bin Laden. Some of my bosses debated for 5 days before they decided to go ahead and give a list of 6 questions to an intermediary. Now, critics charge that this violated CNN's policy. In fact, critics within the company, there was a very heated debate about this. This would violate CNN's policy not to submit written questions in advance. There would be no ability to follow up. What would emerge likely would not be honest answers, but some sort of demagogic propaganda. Would CNN be a tool of a mass murderer? But I believe most of this misses the point. There was a vigorous debate inside CNN, and I think we were right to submit the questions. If he chooses to answer, we'll look at it. We'll control what, when, and whether to air anything that he chooses to say. And I should say now, it's been 3 weeks and we haven't heard from him, so, you know, a lot of people are questioning whether he's ever going to produce those answers. This tension between the media and the government is not going to lessen in the weeks and the months ahead of us. Public opinion will invariably, in the short run at least, be on the side of secrecy. Look at the public opinion polls. People want the press not to ask too many questions, not to reveal too much. We should always listen to the government, but we need to be very, very careful about agreeing to any requests or conditions on how to conduct our business should that arise. News people can perform that job much better than the government. To cover this war, another point, we have incredible technology. Overseas, we have the video phone. It's the latest must-have device. It was first rolled out by CNN when that U.S. spy plane went down in China last April. After that, it was on every network shopping list. The reporter and the camera crew can send pictures via literally a small, it can be a satellite telephone or even a regular phone, whatever they can plug in, but typically out in the field like that, it would be a satellite phone. They don't need something much bigger. Portability, they can get whatever's happening on the air right away. And back here at home, we have all the bells and whistles that make understanding the war a little easier. We've got that wonderful three-dimensional map on the floor in Atlanta that my colleague Joey Chen has been walking and crawling around on in our studio, and we've got visual graphics of B-2 bombers going across the Atlantic, much like a video arcade. But having the technology, the satellites and the video phones, doesn't matter unless we have the access. And contributing to those tensions that I mentioned a moment ago is the fact that this is the most restricted war coverage in memory. During the Gulf War, the American commander, General Schwarzkopf, briefed the press almost every day. This time, the commander, General Tommy Franks, has rarely made himself available. Not only have we not been allowed to accompany any of the ground operations so far, and granted they've only been a few, but we're excluded from the Kitty Hawk, where most of the American Special Operations Forces are now stationed. It's worth remembering that over 24 American correspondents accompanied the Allied invasion on D-Day, and most of them were informed of those plans ahead of time. Secretary Rumsfeld has vowed always to tell the truth, but he's quoted with approval what Churchill said, that in wartime truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. By canceling the Pentagon briefing certain days and repeatedly suggesting that leaks are endangering American forces, the Defense Secretary, I think, has put the press on notice that they believe this is a different time. But I think that this mood contrasts with the realities of how the press has operated in the last month. That story in the Washington Post on October the 19th reporting that the ground war was starting in Afghanistan, after which Don Rumsfeld suggested some leakers were endangering national security. It didn't specify the nature or the location of any operation. In fact, the Pentagon didn't even raise any objections to the story or the information before it was published. Moreover, there have been countless examples over the last few weeks of news organizations voluntarily withholding stories that the government thought posed problems. CNN is still doing that. There's not been one instance where such a request under extraordinary circumstances, and there haven't been very many. In fact, I know of one, but I don't want to rule out others, where this request was ignored. Already, CNN and other organizations are thinking about what we do when there's more intense ground action in Afghanistan, but the Pentagon refuses to let reporters cover it. I guarantee you, and this states the obvious, no one at CNN wants to jeopardize a single serviceman or woman. But the public, with some understandable limits, has a right to know how this war is really going, and not just through the vested filter of our government. With no government at all, there have been moments when we've held back. Our congressional reporter, Jonathan Karl, had at least 3 good sources tell him about the anthrax letter mailed to Tom Daschle. But because of the implications of the story, and because his sources were other senators, frankly, and not from Daschle's office himself, we decided to wait for yet more confirmation before running with it. And while we were waiting and working on it, President Bush, of course, made the announcement himself. This is not about the convenience of journalists or about scoops. It is about trust, and it's about credibility. The infamous credibility gap of the Vietnam War was not, as some people said, because government was too open or provided too much information. It was because government was too selective with the facts, only wishing to stress the good news, not willing to tell Americans the truth. Ultimately, the formulators of that policy, as we know, paid an enormous price. The stakes are no different today. As the Washington Post's Bob Woodward wrote the other day, the public will lose trust in government if it jeopardizes the central component of that trust, and that is being honest and straight. I strongly believe that Americans, after the horror of September the 11th, will have a great deal of patience, will understand that there are inevitable setbacks, and that the road to success is full of not just hurdles, but a few detours if policymakers are honest and straight. I have no idea how this conflict is going to evolve. President Bush has warned that it's going to take a long time, but I urge this great center to step up its role in studying and analyzing the press and how we fulfill our responsibilities. In particular, I urge you, and I know you are doing this in some ways already, find a way to provide a more regular focus on the quality and the quantity of international coverage. Make it harder for anybody to go back to the mindset that prevailed on September the 10th. Find a way also to more thoughtfully explore how television and newspaper executives make some of these very tough decisions. In much the same way, presidential decision-making is studied. And I know that some of this, as I said, is already underway. The Shorenstein Center in Washington, which Marvin heads, linked up with the Brookings Institution this week and already sponsoring regular panel discussions about the media and the war. In closing, I am asked frequently about what happens after the passions of the moment subside and what's television news and CNN going to look like then. Well, clearly the economic and the corporate pressures that existed on September the 10th are still going to be there. Bottom lines and concepts that are arcane to most of us, like EBITDA, margins, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, dividends, and appreciation, will still weigh heavily. Now that may mean significant changes. Joint operating agreements with CNN and one of the major broadcast networks, or 60 Minutes' Don Hewitt's suggestion that the regular routine stories be pooled by all of the television outlets, freeing up resources for the news divisions to do other original and entrepreneurial stories. Maybe we'll return to the Gary Condits. Sex and power will always be with us. Maybe the hyperventilators will reign supreme again on television, and foreign correspondents will be a disappearing breed. I don't want to believe that. I believe what happened September the 11th, I know what happened September the 11th, remains grotesque, almost beyond words. That someone could hate Americans so much sends chills down our spines. We have absorbed impressions that won't quickly, if ever, fade. At the same time, September the 11th was a reminder of what a complicated world we live in and the extraordinary importance of information and the news media in that environment. It has, as my boss, AOL Time Warner CEO Jerry Levin said, clarified our priorities and simplified our focus. I doubt that any of us will be the same again. My friend Bob Mary, who's the chairman of Congressional Quarterly and the biographer of Joe Alsop, says the 20th century ended in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. But the 21st century didn't actually begin until September the 11th. None of us is confident of what lies ahead. Whatever the context, television needs to look for far more interesting and creative ways to present the news. That's not incompatible with quality journalism. Today's New York Times compared to 20 years ago, features livelier writing, interesting whole sections on home and science and health and dining and the fine arts and technology, far more extensive use of graphics, and the old gray lady even has color. But the Times never compromised its mission of journalistic excellence and is a more interesting and a better newspaper. For all that our country suffered on September the 11th and for all the uncertainty to come, perhaps one of the good things to come out of these dark days will be a lasting renewal of purpose for television news, where most of us get our news and information. Just as the New York Times never compromised, I want to believe that 20 years from now, the same will be said of television news in general, and I trust of CNN in particular. Thank you very much. Longer than I wanted to, sorry.
Judy Woodruff once famously said about her time at the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, "We dare to be boring." Well, tonight, you were not boring. Judy has agreed to answer some questions. If you would, please identify yourself and ask your question pointedly and briefly. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caroline Cooper. I'm an East Asian Studies graduate student. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about who specifically the 75 people are, not their names per se, but the 75 people who are supporting CNN's coverage.
Right.
What their training is so that we can ensure that they are producing material that is sort of really grounded and based in the social and political situation as it is, accurate to Afghanistan, and also how these tactics that you're employing at CNN today have shifted, perhaps in comparison to what was going on when you covered Tiananmen Square, the falling of the Berlin Wall, this kind of
That's a very good question, and one that requires, I think, a little more time than we probably have tonight. Who are these 75 people? They are correspondents, the people you see on the air. They are the producers who help them pull their stories together. They are some researchers. They are certainly camera crews, people who operate cameras and do sound, people, technical people. Some of them are people who are support, who do research, or who drivers. That is pretty much a picture of a news. It's as if you take a news bureau and it's writ large across the region, and they are spread out, and people's, their responsibilities may change. Somebody may be on the air one day and they may be producing the next, or somebody may be doing research one day and driving the next. So the responsibilities are shifting in an ever-changing environment. Are they all grounded academic, in the kind of, I think the kind of standard you're referring to? Do they all have PhDs in, Asian history, and, do they know the intricacies of the Afghan political and economic and social system? No. But they are all on a fast learning curve, just as all of us are after September the 11th. A lot of people didn't know that the capital of the capital of Afghanistan was Kabul. So we're all having to learn very, very fast. How does it compare with when we covered Tiananmen? We have more people, we're willing to put more resources out there, and the technology, as I tried to suggest, is an advance over what it was then. Does it mean we always do a better job? No. Sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes the technology fails you, but by and large, I think the American people are better served by more information rather than less, and by more people trying to do a good job than less.
Let me call your attention. We have mics here and another one up here, as well as one over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is George Wallner, and I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how CNN plans to, or is talking about, handling the story of the 1,000+ suspects that have been rounded up and by the FBI and are being held, secretly, with no information being released to the press.
Well, we have reported on that almost daily. I know I have heard it mentioned in our coverage. frankly, the Justice Department is not giving any information about them. I mean, all the reporters can do is ask. They can go around and try to get information. But as you can imagine, as I'm sure all of you can imagine, this is not something that they're sharing easily. They feel it's entirely within their right to hold these people, and I'm sure the days are going to come when we are going to call into question some of these decisions that they've made. It's hard for us to believe that every single one of the 1,000 has done something that warrants their being held for days and days, weeks and weeks, and even months. But in this climate that we're in, at war, it's very difficult to challenge. I mean, we are asking questions, but short of storming the jails and the federal prison system and so forth, I don't know how we get more information. But we keep asking, and as we should, and as we'll continue to do.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
My name is Matthias Ma. I'm a second-year student. Over here.
Where are you?
Up here.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, sorry. At the Harvard Business School. And I have a question regarding the cutback in foreign bureaus that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Now, the networks would typically argue that this is because people are less and less interested in foreign news. So when you argue that there should be a renewed interest from the networks and from the TV stations in foreign bureaus and foreign correspondents, how do you reconcile that with this perceived disinterest? How would you make people interested in foreign news again?
Figure out a way to make it interesting. I mean, the stories that I cited for you that, if they'd been proposed on September the 10th, Kashmir, bioterrorism, it's incumbent on us in a time when the attention of Americans is divided in so many places to figure out a way to make these stories interesting. Now, does that mean that you should be fed a steady diet on CNN or any other channel of this kind of information? No, but there should be places you can turn to at certain times of the day, for example, an hour a day, or a day of the week, or 5 days of the week. I mean, for me, more is better in this arena. I don't think it's asking too much to set aside a half hour, an hour, and my friend Rick Kaplan and I have had discussions about this. We won't debate it here in front of all of you, but there are different ways of doing it. I mean, there are some who say you ought to sprinkle international coverage throughout the day. There are others who say people ought to have a reliable place they know they can turn on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 9 o'clock at night and get international news. I just think, we have to accept that responsibility, and we have to put money into that coverage. It's expensive to keep these bureaus open year-round and to pay for correspondents and producers and crews to be there. Much more expensive than it is for the newspapers, and even the newspapers have cut back in these bureaus. There are very few American newspapers that now have the bureaus overseas that they used to. But we have to look upon this as a priority. What is it? 10% of the people now living in the United States were born somewhere else. The United States is the world. We have a stake in the world. A fraction of the world's population speaks English. We are living in a planet that has shrunk. We are now dealing with a story that is overwhelming some of us because the information is coming out so fast and so thick every day. We can barely keep up with it. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in the news business to figure out a way to carry out that responsibility to keep people informed. If we don't do it, who's going to? I mean, it's our responsibility to make it interesting.
Good evening. My name is Amit Borde. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. Building on the point of the bottom line that you mentioned a while back, CNN and AOL Time Warner recently announced several changes in the way news is being presented at CNN, and we have seen the box shrink to the 3/4 quarters on the right side. We've seen MSNBC-style graphs, actresses being hired as anchors, pop music being added, and the background, all that stuff. So it seems to me that there is a clear distinction being made between presenters and journalists. And as a veteran at this institution, CNN, how do you deal with this transition, being both a journalist and a presenter?
I think that there is a distinction made at CNN between the presenters at headline news, who are basically readers for the most part. They're not asked to interpret stories or to react to breaking news, if you will, and the anchors at the CNN domestic channel, where the anchors are frequently asked to deal with news that is coming in, and particularly in the last 2 months, as you can imagine, where the news is changing all the time. I think there's a distinction made. I will say, in defense of Andrea Thompson, the woman you're mentioning, she did have, acting was her career for a number of years, but she then made a very serious decision to go into journalism. She worked at it. She put in some important time at a television station in Albuquerque, I believe, and CNN hired her. Part of television is presentation, and if you can't figure out a way to get people to watch you, it doesn't matter how good your information is. It doesn't matter how great your reporting is. And what we've got to always figure out a way to do is to find a balance between a way, I said in answer to his question, a way to make it interesting and make it compelling, make people want to watch you, but also spend the effort and the money to cover the news so that you're giving people their meat and vegetables and fruit and not just dessert.
Hi, my name is Britt Gottschalk, and I'm a junior at the George Washington University and a former intern at CNN. My question applies to a talk that Dan Rather had with Marvin Kalb in Washington, the National Press Club, a couple weeks ago. And one of the questions that Mr. Rather got from the audience was that there is a lot of international news that the journalists try to put out there, and it's just simply not being received. And how did
I'm sorry, national or international?
International news. And the audience member asked Mr. Rather, how do you deal with that? And what kind of obligation do Americans have? And Mr. Rather responded that sometimes international news just simply isn't received by an American audience. And what kind of obligation? And he said that Americans have an obligation as well. How would you respond to that?
I think that's true. I mean, what I was saying in answer to his question is we have an obligation to make it interesting. In fact, people haven't, there's some responsibility too on the part of the citizens to know more about the world that we live in. If we could all stand around and talk about the American educational system and whether, we are teaching our children in grammar school and on up enough about the rest of the world. Are they getting an education that prepares them to deal with a world that is complicated and is going to call on them to make decisions that affect more than just their neighborhood or their city? So there are all sorts of players in this equation. But the part that I'm involved in, I can't have much of an effect on the educational system. I can have some effect, I'd like to think, on the television news business. And I think there's a lot more that we can do. But I think Dan is right. I mean, you can't. At some point, you can make it interesting, you can make it compelling, but if people refuse to watch or they'd rather watch something else, you can only do so much. But I do think people will come. You can bring them, you can draw them.
My name's Erin Simpson. I'm a first-year student down the street at the Department of Government. You mentioned this evening the difference between, or what you consider the difference between pundits and journalists. And I've heard Molly Ivins make a similar distinction. And she talks about how nothing gives you an idea of the complexity of the truth than covering a 5-car pileup on a Texas highway. And I was wondering if you could broaden your statement as to what distinguishes the journalists from the pundits in terms of not just what their delivery is, in terms of it's kind of more exciting to watch, pundits sometimes argue with each other as opposed to journalists cover the news, but what the questions they ask and how they come about the answers to them.
Well, journalists, first of all, and very quickly, because I realize that time is tight here. What's a journalist? I mean, we've almost come to the point where anybody who puts a label on their jacket and gets a press pass is a journalist. In fact, the good journalists, the people who've paid their dues, the people I was talking about, are people who've spent a few months and a few years covering, if it's politics, covering City Hall, covering a state legislature maybe, or maybe they've been in Washington, they've covered Capitol Hill for a while. They've spent some time at it. They know what it's like to hound a source for information and get turned down, to have to get a story confirmed by 2 or 3 or more people before going with it. And they've had to write on deadline and all of these things. as you know, we don't get inducted into some special fraternity or sorority to practice journalism. We come at it from many, many different directions. People who cover, who are good at covering the business and economic stories are people who've spent some time doing that. Maybe they have a degree in economics. I distinguish that from pundits because in the sense that these are people who just landed in a television studio one day to talk because they can talk well. Not all of them, and I'm not going to name any names. I'm going to leave that up to you. But yes, it's colorful. Yes, it's heat. Is it always light? Not necessarily. My main point, though, tonight is the blurring of the line, that the public, in seeing this argument culture that's grown up, begins to assume that journalists are have as thin a background, if you will, as the pundits do, and they expect us to have opinions about everything, when that's not our job at all. Our job is to report and to put stories in context when appropriate, but not to give you our personal opinions. And I think that line has been crossed time and again to the point that journalism has changed dramatically in this country. Yeah.
Let's take two more, here and here.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Bolger, a graduate student in real estate. And what I wanted to ask you is to draw on your political background of reporting, and what are the things you've noticed most, or what are the things that have struck you most about the bipartisan nature of politics post-September 11th? And how has that changed? So what is the legitimate bipartisan workings that you've noticed? And how do you feel the battlefield of hardball political confrontation has been changed as a result of this?
Well, I'll just give you the most immediate example that comes to mind, and that is Alex mentioned that I have anchored a program. I did co-anchor with Bernie Shaw for 8 years, almost 8 years, and then Bernie retired in late February of this year, and since then I was doing it on my own. That show was on the air through September the 10th. Since then, the feeling has been that politics has been, in the partisan sense, has been superseded, and I agree with it wholeheartedly by what's happened and what we're doing, that we're engaged in the war, that we are dealing with a threat, terror threat here at home, and that politics, as we covered it before, where practically everything was seen through the prism of here's what the Democrats think and here's what the Republicans think, has not completely fallen away, but has faded somewhat. Now, having said that, are there issues where we're seeing a partisan divide? Absolutely. You're looking at it right now in the aviation security bill and the debate on that right up until tonight, and I don't even know what the result was. Anybody know what the vote was? It was while we were having dinner, I guess. But there you see Democrats who are in favor of, the screeners at the airport being all government employees, and the Republicans by and large on the other side. Not entirely, that's in the House, and the Senate it's a little bit different. So you're starting to see partisan politics creep back in. It hasn't gone away permanently. But I do think for the foreseeable future, what is going on, what we are doing as a country in fighting this war and in standing up to this unseen enemy has made the squabbles and the arguments and a lot of the meat and potatoes of a program like Inside Politics pale by comparison. There's still politics going on. People are still having discussions. The president still wants a stimulus bill. The Democrats don't agree. But somehow it hasn't risen, I think, to the level that it was before. Is it going to come back? Absolutely, it's going to come back, but not right now. And I don't see it in the immediate future.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Heather Brown. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School, originally from Philadelphia. And I was wondering if I could just get your thoughts on Walter Isaacson's memo to CNN foreign correspondents about balance in wartime coverage. Did you think it was appropriate, and did you think it was necessary to issue that memo?
Yeah, Walter Isaacson is the chairman of the CNN News Group, and he on Tuesday of this week, actually it was Monday night, I think that it originally came out, as as it became clear that our CNN correspondent, Nick Robertson, was going to be part of a small group of journalists who were taken into Afghanistan by the Taliban and allowed to see certain sites that they controlled, and we knew those were going to be the ground rules. The rules were going to be, you can say what you want, but we're going to tell you what you can see. There was a lot of thinking in our news organization, as I'm sure there was at others, about how do you, assuming they take us in and they show us, civilian casualties, how do we present that in a balanced way to the American people without looking like we're just a tool of the Taliban? And I think Walter, who's my boss, in an effort to anticipate what that would look like, put out some guidance saying, we've got to remember that as we present this, and as you introduce Nick Robertson's piece, which is what the anchors and the other correspondents are involved in doing, that you remind the audience that we're only getting part of the story, that you're seeing behind the lines with the Taliban, and just to keep that in perspective. We're all struggling with this. There haven't been any easy answers that I'm aware of since September the 11th. I mean, every day practically has presented another scenario where we've had to make a judgment call, and this is brand new territory. We haven't been here before. And I've heard the criticism, some have said, well, you shouldn't do that. Reporters, you ought to say let the American people digest the whole thing. Sure, they're capable of digesting it, just as they are capable of digesting a 30-minute long diatribe from Osama bin Laden. But are we completely comfortable as a news organization, airing that time and time again, and of putting these pictures on of whatever civilian casualties there may be behind enemy lines without any context? I think that it was well considered on his part to say to all of us, let's put some context in there. But again, this is virgin territory. We haven't done this before. I mean, none of us was around in World War II. And that's the closest equivalent to what we're doing right now. We are at war. I mean, unlike even Vietnam, which I wasn't around to cover either. I mean, it is in a profoundly different time. And, we're only beginning to consider some of these questions that you raise tonight. Thank you very much. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Let me remind you that the conversation will continue at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in the 5th floor of Taubman. Thank you all very much, and Judy Woodruff, again, thank you.
I was long-winded. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're wonderful. It was great. It was a terrific,
could have chopped it by
thoughtful, rich, deep piece.
That was really good. And you know what's so good about it? It's refreshingly honest. I mean, you
well, I left out.
Yeah, no, it really was. No, it's very thoughtful.
No, but thank you very much. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for your question. I appreciated it. Thank you. Frank?